Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Agronomy in Action Insight Series. We're very excited that you have joined us this morning. We hope that over the next few weeks you join us each Thursday as the Golden Harvest Agronomy team brings forward some really insightful and impactful agronomy content to help drive and improve yields on your home farm. With that being said, our topic for today is around the Golden Harvest Research Report. We'll be discussing the key drivers in the 2024 agronomy research trials that were performed here this past year. With that being said, we are very excited to bring forward today's session around the key drivers of agronomy research in 2024. And we have three presenters with us to do that today. We have Bruce Battles, our technical agronomy manager at Syngenta, joining us. We have Brad Bernhardt, an agronomic research scientist that's located in Illinois. And then another one of our agronomic research scientists, Aaron Sindelar, who are here to talk through the trials and the work that this team has been doing in years past, but particularly this past year. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Bruce here this morning to get us started. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you, Julia, and welcome to everybody. Good morning, and thanks for being here today to help us kick off this next 2025 season of our webinar series. We've had great participation in the last few years, and look forward to another season of interaction, participation, and being able to sharing agronomy information in a timely manner throughout the winter months in preparation for this 2025 growing season. We're also really excited to continue what we consider a legacy within Golden Harvest of delivering agronomy information that really started all the way from the beginning of the Golden Harvest brand. It was deeply rooted within a lot of the 5 family-owned companies that come together to form Golden Harvest. And just over 40 years ago today, we formalized that more within what we formerly called Agronomy Up Front, and now referred to as Agronomy in Action, with a dedicated research agronomy team that can go out and have the equipment and capabilities and technology to test very unique concepts, agronomic concepts, as well as technologies in a way that is highly repeatable with good results. We do have a variety of trials that we do on a year-to-year basis within our team that spread all the way from Nebraska to Illinois, covering 4 central states, and do annual trials and repeat those each year. And as an output, you can see that we deliver our information in one way, not only through our agronomy research reports that you can see in front of us, dating way back all the way back into the 80s in different shapes and sizes, but also is available on our website, and you can see not only 2025 results as well as other results dating back multiple years. So a couple of things that we really try to focus on. We realize there are multiple sources of agronomic information that you have available to you. And so how we try to differentiate ourselves within this area and what we feel like we can provide best to our customer base is understanding our genetics and understanding how our genetics respond to specific management type of practices. So that's key of the most trials we do. We try to focus on understanding those genetic by environment, by management type of interactions. And then secondly, we really try to focus in on repeatable results. There's, again, a lot of information out there and a lot of shapes and sizes and forms, but a lot of what I've noticed is how repeatable some of that is may be in question. And we feel very confident in what we publish and understanding and being as transparent as possible about how repeatable we think those are. So we will hear from a couple of our brightest minds within our agronomy research teams today. Before we jump into that, the topics that we'll be covering will range a little bit, but we wanted to focus on 3 specific trials that we did this year out of multiple trials that we won't be able to talk about today. But the first one that we'll focus on, we had a corn and soybean trial that really looked at what different management practices and trying to understand which one of those is most valuable in any given year. 2024 was unique, like most years, and so sometimes those answers are different. Secondly, that we'll look into is a response to fertility. We feel like hybrids have changed and evolved over the years, and due to that, the way that they access and resource nutrients is somewhat in fact impacted by placement and quantities. And maybe it may be more complicated than just looking at a traditional soil test result and understanding if you're going to get a response or not. So we'll dive deeper into some of those results. And lastly, what better of a year than any to look at nitrogen with the rainfall we had this year and understand the value of side dressing and look deeper at some of the nuances of when you are side dressing. What are the value of other things such as placement, but as well as the stabilizers and things like that that can also add additional value. Before we jump into our first speaker, though, I think with the interaction that we expect with these trials to see due to weather, it's good to level set ourselves on what kind of year we had in 2024. And so I'll quickly go through a couple of slides here that help us remind and frame up the year that we just went through. That did change depending on where you're sitting at today on this call. But in general, if there were two words that I had to summarize for the year, it's warm and wet. But with that, there's always nuances of it, right? That weather is very regionalized and very localized. So let's go through that. When we think about the spring we had, starting April all the way through June, in that time frame, the key vegetative stages of development, when that plant's determining yield potential, we had a relatively wet April across most areas, but receiving really good moisture and rainfalls in areas that a lot of areas that were in a drought type of condition. So it really helped us recover our soil moisture levels, and that extended into May in some areas, as you can see on the illustrated on the map, southern Minnesota as well as northern Iowa into South Dakota got more than their fair share of those conditions. So although the moisture was welcome in most areas as far as building up our soil supplies, it was a little excessive in those areas and was a factor that those growing regions had to contend with most all the year and carried through to the end of the season. They were still seeing those effects of that. In general, we had a wet and warm June as well, which the other thing that comes with that wetness and especially warmth, you had a lot of mineralization of nitrogen early, followed by moisture. We're always at risk of nitrogen loss, but we did have great conditions in the majority of areas to set the plant up during the vegetative stages to have large yield potential and through ear formation and development. As we kind of progress through July into that more focus on that time frame, a lot of those areas that received really heavy rainfall early got a little bit of a reprieve, such as southern Minnesota. And more importantly, other areas that such as Iowa, eastern Iowa, Illinois, even parts of Wisconsin, a large portion of the eastern Corn Belt got some really welcome rains that set up really good for those reproductive stages. And so that wet July in a lot of areas, although not everywhere, really carried through to setting up yield potential and carrying out grain fill through the rest of the season. The temperature aspect of this is always interesting as well, right? When we look at the season as a whole, we would say a warm year in general. For the year, for the entire growing season, we were above average in heat units as well as temperature. But the nuance of that is it was actually below average when we look at the month of July. And so that was really critical and very favorable to, again, pollination and development and setting up yield potential in there. So we had some really good elements of really timely essence of the temperature cooling off during those key phases that impacted grain field, but also probably lessened some of the severity of disease pressure in there that followed into August, as well as August, September, October months being much drier than normal. And we saw very early soybean harvests and things like that due to that and other challenges that came with that. But in general, that kind of summarizes our 2024 growing season. And I think that sets up really the stage for our next speaker to join us here. Brad Bernhard is going to go through our soybean management factors that impacted us the most in 2024. Brad, all yours.
Good morning, everybody. Really excited to be here today to talk about two trials that we did, looking at which management factors were most important in terms of yield in 2024. First, we're going to start here with soybeans. This graph here is the U.S. average historical soybean yield trends dating back to the 1960s. And you can see back in the 1960s, my grandpa would have been really excited to get 25 bushel soybeans on his farm. However, today, I think this year, the U.S. average soybean yield was around 52 bushels an acre. So we've steadily increased yields over the decades. And if you're in the core of the Midwest growing area, you probably think 52 bushels an acre is a crop failure. You're probably shooting for more like 70 or 80 bushels an acre. But again, this is the U.S. average yield. And on average, we are increasing soybean yield just under a half a bushel per acre per year. And the biggest driving factor of this is definitely genetics and improved genetics, better genetics, more tolerant genetics. So that's really where we're seeing a lot of the yield increases, but also think about soybean management. We've also have done a lot of research in how to properly manage soybeans to help with that yield potential. So a lot of it driven by genetics, but also management as well. And that's really what we're going to talk about in this next trial is different management practices to improve soybean yield. So the way we designed this trial in 2024 is we grew soybeans under 5 different management regimes. So we had a base program where we planted soybeans and really didn't do any additional inputs with it at all. It did have the base fertility program, whatever the grower was already doing. So whether he applied dry fertilizer in the fall or manure, or in most cases where our trials were at, there was no additional fertility applied at all. So whatever that base fertility program that grower was doing, that's what that first management regime was. The first management practice that we were looking at was incremental fertility. So fertility on top of what that grower was already doing. We were focusing on P and K, kind of a banded with the planter in a 2x2x2 placement. The other management factor we were looking at was a foliar package, and that foliar package was a combination of a plant growth regulator. We were using Ascend SL, and then also a micronutrient package as well, which was Max and Ultra ZMB. We applied that at 2 different timings, so at the V4 timing, and then again at the R3 timing. The other management factor was looking at foliar protection. So this was a combination of a fungicide, Mirvis Neo, and then also an insecticide, Indigo ZCX, at that R3 growth stage. And that last management regime there was just the combination of all of them. So the additional fertility, the foliar package of the plant growth regulators and micronutrients, and then that foliar protection as well. So see if there's any synergistic effect with these different management practices. We did plant 6 Golden Harvest varieties at each location, and you can see our locations there on that map on the right. We did break it up by relative maturity group. So the orange was like an early set, the black dots were a mid set, and the blue dots were a later RM set. Now, we did look at the interaction of the varieties and these different management factors, and the difference in how these hybrids respond, or these varieties responded, were the difference between how they responded were pretty minimal and also inconsistent. So a lot of the data I'm going to go through is averaged across all 6 varieties. So this bar graph here would be the average of all 6 varieties at each location and the average across all 8 locations, the response we were getting from these management factors. So on average, the check, we were yielding about 74 bushels per acre. We really didn't see any consistent response to the incremental fertility. Now, that does depend on the location and some of the soil fertility characteristics that we'll dive a little bit more deep into. Similarly, the foliar package of the PGR and micronutrient, again, didn't see very big response to that as well. The key driver in this study was definitely the fungicide and insecticide package. Most consistently increased yield, and on average across all locations and varieties, we were getting about a 2.2 bushel per acre response. And when we add all those management practices together in that combination treatment, really didn't see any additional yield gain to that at all. A lot of that yield increase was all driven from that fungicide and insecticide package. So that's average across all the locations. So let's dive a little bit more deeper into each individual location. So here I have the 8 locations across the top, and the first column, or the first row I want to draw your attention to there, is that base program. So the base yields at these locations, and that ranged anywhere from 57 bushel per acre at Malta, Illinois, all the way up to almost 87 bushel per acre at Clinton, Illinois. So a wide range in yield environments that we were dealing with here. And if you look at that, for the response of fertility at each location, it was very variable to minimal to no response. And then there was a couple locations where we were a bushel or a bushel plus at Clinton, Illinois and Grundy Center there. Interestingly, if you look at the soil fertility levels at those 2 locations, they were both on the lower side in terms of phosphorus. So I think we were seeing some of the phosphorus response there. But that Waterloo location, where we didn't see any response, that was also very low in phosphorus as well. And we didn't see a response there. So just kind of shows you that the soil test levels isn't always going to predict whether you're going to see a response to fertility. And a similar story goes with the Slater, Iowa location. It was low in potassium, and again, didn't see a response to that potassium fertilizer that we added. Looking at the PGR and microfoliar package across the locations, you can see that we saw a very minimal response. Only at one location did we get at least a bushel response there at that Slater, Iowa location, but on average, very minimal response to that management factor. Now I'll highlight the cells that were statistically significant, or where we saw some of our greatest yield response at each location. And as you can see there, what really pulls out again is that foliar protection, that combination of a fungicide and insecticide. 3 of our 8 locations had a statistical response, and on average was also a statistical response of about 2.2 bushels per acre. So it was the most consistent one. And again, it just depended on what location you're at. It ranged from a 2.1 bushel all the way up to almost a 6 bushel response at that Clay Center, Kansas location. And I will say that these responses were coming from locations that had minimal disease and insect pressure. We saw a little bit of disease pressure at some locations, but never really progressed to a level that you would think would impact yield. So a lot of these responses are more of a plant health effect rather than a disease or insect suppression. The other thing I find interesting looking at this graph is if you look at the combination treatment there in the bottom, the 3 highlighted ones at the 3 locations, those were all statistically significant with the combination treatment, but not with any of the individual factors. So what that's kind of highlighting is that at those locations, there must have been some kind of a synergistic effect of never really seeing a response to the individual factors, but when you add them all together, that's where we're seeing our highest yield potential at those locations. We will dive a little bit into varieties here. So this graph here on the bottom, I broke it up between the 3 different RM groups that we were working with. So that early RM group would have been across 3 locations, mid RM was 3 locations, and then that late RM was just 2 locations. And again, within each of those RM groups, we had 6 varieties, and that's what's represented by those orange dots there. And that's just the individual yield of those varieties. So if you look at that early RM group, if you were just to pick one variety, if you pick the highest yielding variety compared to if you just pick the lowest yielding variety, there was a 5.6 bushel per acre swing there and just the variety you picked. And it's even amplified in the mid RM group. So, if you pick the highest yielding variety compared to the lowest yielding, it was an 11.2 bushel per acre swing there without even doing any management at all. So this kind of just illustrates that not even thinking about management, the first step into setting yourself up for success in a given growing season is your variety selection. And that's the most important thing before you even think about some of the in-season management, because our biggest driver of in-season management was fungicide, and that was only about a 2.1 to 5.3 bushel per acre swing compared to the variety selection. Again, could be up to an over 11 bushel per acre swing. So really picking the right variety is a key driver here. So we just want to wrap this up, soybeans, with some key takeaways. Again, variety selection was the most important thing we could have done this year, and really probably every year. In 2024, the foliar protection package was the most consistently was what increased soybean yields. And in 2024, we didn't see really any difference between how varieties responded to these different management systems, and it's generally typical under normal growing conditions. And then when you think about next year going into 2025 and your management strategy, think about your farm and kind of tailor your management to your given fields and what you know about them. First you need to be correcting any soil fertility level issues you may have, but then think about, if that field has a history of disease or insect pressure, you should be thinking about that foliar protection package or any other environmental stresses. So really tailor it to your individual farms. So that's going to wrap up soybeans, and we're going to move on to corn. We did a similar study in corn, but first, before we get into that, I'm going to start off with a poll question. So the poll question is, which management factor do you think had the biggest impact on corn yield? Again, very similar style to what we just went through in soybeans, but now think about corn and your farm. The four options you have to select from is fertility, that's PK, sulfur, any kind of micros you may be using. Nitrogen, not only think about rate, but different timings you may have done. Fungicide, and then the last one there is seeding rate. So which management factor do you think had the biggest impact on your farm this year for some of the decisions that you made? You may notice I don't have hybrid listed there because, kind of thinking about what we just went through on soybeans, hybrid selection is probably going to be the biggest factor every year. It could be 20, 30, 40, 50 bushel swing on what hybrid you select. So don't have that one as an option, but think about some of the other management decisions you have. Okay, we got the results in, and between fertility, fungicide, and seeding rate, pretty comparable there. 14 to 18% of you think that was had the biggest impact on your farm this year. But definitely the top one there was nitrogen rate, thinking about either rate or timing, with over half of you thinking that was the biggest decision you made this year. So really no wrong answer. As we kind of just went through with soybeans, it really depended on the location, and we're going to dive into a little bit of the research we did this year at our locations and think a little bit more about that. So in corn, again, it was a very similar setup, but we did look at a couple different factors here. So again, we had a base program, whatever that grower was already doing in terms of fertility, not only P and K, but also nitrogen as well, whatever that base nitrogen rate he was putting on. Typically, it ranged between 150 to 180 pounds of nitrogen, depending on the location. And then we went in there and did incremental fertility on top of that. So really, again, focusing on PK and sulfur, 35 pounds of P, 32 K, 17 pounds of sulfur, and some zinc as well. Again, we were banding that with the planter. The other factor we looked at was sidedress nitrogen. This was 60 pounds, Y dropped at the V5 growth stage. Again, this would be on top of whatever that base nitrogen program was. We looked at fungicide, Mirabis Neo at R1. We did have 3 seeding rates, 32, 36, and 40,000 seeds per acre. And we did all of those different management factors at all 3 of those seeding rates. So pretty comprehensive study. And then again, that combination treatment where we applied all those treatments in combination together. We did have 2 RM sets and 2 hybrids within each RM set. So the 101 and 103 day for the early hybrid set, and then 110 and 113 day for that later RM set. We did have 9 locations to start with, planted 9, but we lost 3 of those. Kind of showing that graph earlier, that weather graph. We lost the 2 northern sites from too much rain early on, and then we also lost our Waterloo site from a wind event as well later. Here's just some pictures of how we were conducting the study. Again, that planter we were using, we were banding that P and K 2x2x2. We were using 360 bandits there, and then the sulfur was ATS that we were dribbling off the back of the planter. Again, just trying to concentrate those nutrients in a band near that plant is what we were looking for. The sidedress nitrogen, we were wide dropping there, placing that UAN solution right along the crop row, and then our fungicide application we make with a drone in these studies. Here's some visuals from in season. So this was at the Clinton, Illinois site, the grower standard there on the left, and then the row on the right would have been the combination treatment. It had incremental fertility and sidedress nitrogen added to it at this particular point in the growing season when we took the picture. Similarly, here's another photo at Slater, Iowa. Again, had that incremental fertility and nitrogen, sidedress nitrogen applied there on the right compared to the grower standard on the left. You can see not only additional growth there, probably a growth stage ahead, but also a little bit greener. I think those rows on the left there may have had a little bit of sulfur deficiency with it. So here are the yield results. This is going to be averaged across the 2 hybrids at each location, the 3 seeding rates, and all 6 locations. So on average, we're getting about 260 bushels an acre. Adding that incremental fertility was worth about 4 bushels. But again, that's going to depend on the location we were at and the soil fertility levels. The sidedress nitrogen was the individual factor that had the largest yield response, was really the driver here at that 8 bushel response. And, kind of wasn't really surprised by that based off of some of the weather we had. Again, kind of Bruce walked through some of the wet early spring we had. With being such a wet spring in April, May, and June, roots didn't really grow down as much, and we probably pushed some of that nitrogen lower in the soil profile. So I think those roots weren't able to get some of that to that nitrogen lower in the soil profile. And so that sidedress nitrogen, applying it right along the plant there in that root zone, probably really helped in a lot of locations this year. Fungicide, we're averaging about a 6 bushel response, and that's really going to depend on the location as well, that we'll get into. And then that combination treatment was just about an additive effect if we added up the fertility, sidedress, and fungicide. All 3 of those is where we got that highest yield of that combination treatment. So we'll dive into a little bit into the individual locations. So again, just looking at that base program there, yields range anywhere from 220 bushels at Grundy Center all the way up to 290 bushels an acre at Clay Center, Kansas. Now, I do want to point out that is an irrigated site. They do grow some high yields there in Kansas on irrigation. So looking at that fertility at each individual location, you can see that really pretty minimal response to that incremental fertility, except that at Slater, Iowa. That's where we saw the biggest response, 13 bushels an acre. And that was the one location that we had deficient levels in potassium. So a lot of that was probably driven by the potassium, but also the sulfur as well. As we just saw in that picture, there was some sulfur deficiency. So moving on to sidedress nitrogen, our most consistent management factor that increased yield across the locations, and also probably had some of the highest response. At 4 of our 6 locations, we had a statistical response to that sidedress nitrogen. In terms of fungicide, really depending on the location you're at, probably saw a pretty good response at 3 of the 6 locations from 8 up to 13 bushels per acre. And similar to corn or similar to soybeans, we saw pretty minimal disease pressure this year at across these sites. We saw some gray leaf spot, some tar spot, but saw it early, and it never really progressed into the canopy to a point where you would think it would impact yield. So again, some of that fungicide response is likely due to a plant health effect. And lastly, looking at that combination treatment, you can see that's where we kind of saw our highest yields across the board. What's interesting is that the 2 locations I want to point out, Clay Center, Kansas, at 12 bushels of response there. If you add up the individual factors, pretty minimal. But if we did the combination treatment, all those, that's where we saw our biggest response there. So you can see a synergistic effect at that location where it's a 1 + 1 = 3 type of approach. And we also saw that at our Janesville, Wisconsin site as well. So much higher response with that systems approach to management, starting early, managing in season, and finishing off with the foliar protection. That's where we saw that synergistic effect at Janesville. Thinking about seeding rate, First, I'll want to point out just those bars on the right there. That's the average across all locations and the two hybrids. And we saw a pretty consistent response to seeding rate this year, gaining 4 bushels going up to 36,000, and then another 4 bushels going up to 40,000 plants per acre. Usually, on any given year, that 36,000 is usually the sweet spot. But this year, with the ideal growing conditions we had, we saw a little bit higher increase to seeding rate than we have in the past. And it was pretty consistent across all of our locations, with the exception of Slater. That was the one location we didn't see any response to seeding rate. And maybe that had something to do with the lower soil fertility levels at that location. So we'll move on and think about the individual hybrid. So again, we had an early RM set at 2 locations and a later RM set at 4 locations. If you just look at the base yields there for that early RM set, the 101 and 103 day hybrid, the G03U08 definitely was a higher yielding hybrid under some base management. But the G01U74 was much more responsive to the individual management factors. So a good response to fertility and fungicide, but that particular hybrid really likes hydrous nitrogen. That is one thing that particular hybrid cannot be short on. Do not short that hybrid of nitrogen. Compared to the G03U08, pretty minimal response to each individual factor. So that particular hybrid, just adding one more thing probably isn't going to increase yield, but it really liked when we had that combination treatment of adding, starting that plant off early with fertility and protecting that plant later in the season with the fungicide. That's what maximized the yield potential of that hybrid. Looking at the 2 late RM hybrids, the 110 day and 113 day, pretty similar yields with the base fertility program or the base management program. That G10U97, pretty consistent response to all 3 management factors there. So that particular hybrid really likes management. And then the G13U96, it was really the sidedress nitrogen that stuck out for that hybrid. Make sure that hybrid has enough nitrogen and then protect it with a foliar fungicide as well. Looking at the response to seeding rate between these hybrids, the G01U73, that particular hybrid kind of maximized its yield potential at 36,000. So that hybrid likes moderate seeding rates. G03U08 was definitely our most responsive hybrid to seeding rate. So that one, you can bump up seeding rates a little bit more above average than you typically would. And then in the late RM set, both of those hybrids were pretty consistent in their response to seeding rate, just a little bit less responsive than that 103 day hybrid. So just to summarize some of the key findings here of between the different hybrids, G01U74 planted at a modern seeding rate and make sure that N is not limiting. The G03U08, that one likes population and definitely prefers the systems approach to management. The G10U97, that one was the one that responded to the individual management practices, likes fertility, likes sidedress nitrogen, likes fungicide. And that one kind of topped out at moderate to higher seeding rates. And then the G13U96, that's the one that liked the supplemental N and additional plant health with fungicide. So just to summarize our trial in general, this year, every year is going to be different, but this year in 2024, sidedress nitrogen definitely provided the greatest yield response. Some of the ideal growing conditions we had favored the higher seeding rates, probably more than it has in years past. And then that last point there is just really kind of the key takeaway of this study is really matching the right hybrid with the optimal seeding rate, and the correct management for that given hybrid is what really was the key to driving yields this year. So that's all I have for our management trials, and I'm going to toss it to Aaron, and he's going to dig a little bit deeper into some of these core management factors.
Thanks, Brad. Good morning, everybody. Great to see a nice crowd here for our first webinar for the season. As Brad showed with his data, we really emphasize the value of high fertility, as well as that side dress nitrogen application or that in-season nitrogen application. And what the remainder of my time is going to be covering is really doing a deep dive into understanding where some of this incremental fertility really brings the most value, as well as the final part will be really deep diving into nitrogen side dressing and what we can do to really maximize our return on that investment. So moving forward with the incremental fertility component, before we really get deep into the weeds about talking through the data, let's take a step back and talk about just the architecture of a corn plant's root system. When it comes to that root system, it's not uncommon to get 3 to 4, maybe even deeper than 4 feet of proliferation vertically through the root profile, through the soil profile. But when we look at the horizontal aspect of that root system, typically we're only looking at about 6 to 8 inches in diameter across the board. So, when you think about some of these applications where maybe a blanket application or you're doing a side dress application, splitting that row down the middle, and if we think through some of the nutrient dynamics, specifically around phosphorus and potassium, which are really mobile nutrients where we may see an inch or two maximum of movement of those nutrients, how much of that is really reaching that crop and utilized by that crop that growing season? When we talk about this zone placement of fertilizer concept, really what we're trying to do is maximize the placement, put it in a zone near that root system so that it can access it and utilize it for that growing system or that growing season. Now, we can do this through various methods. We talk about zone placement, but in reality, we can achieve that through a culture injection, perhaps laying a nutrient band down simultaneously with strip tillage, or in our case that we'll talk about a little bit later is planter application through various modes of delivery, maybe in furrow, 2x2, or a surface dribble application. So this is a trial, or at least a concept that has been a core research topic for us for the last several years. And that's really not only understanding the value of general incremental fertility, but also characterizing how our hybrids respond to that type of management. We've been doing these trials over a 4-year period at 38 sites across the Corn Belt, and looking at a wide panel of our Golden Harvest hybrids, ranging from as early as 80 days all the way up to 118 days. So a pretty significant RM spread depending on the location of those trials. Each individual hybrid is getting two different types of fertility managements applied to them. The first one is our base fertility program, where essentially that is just the grower's normal program, where perhaps there was a blanket P and K application, the previous fall or the spring, or maybe there wasn't any application at all, but we're applying those hybrids to that base management. And then we have a zone management program where we're placing incremental amounts of key nutrients near the root system with our planters. And I won't go into the individual numbers, but we are applying nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and a little bit of zinc in our fertilizer mix. Jumping right into the data, overall, what we've seen over these 38 locations over 4 years has been a 13.5 bushel response on average, regardless of hybrid. To even peel back the onion a little bit further, 82% of those locations saw at least a 5 bushel acre response to the incremental fertility. Now, the key thing to remember here is that these sites vary pretty drastically in their yield potential, differing soil conditions, geographically, planting conditions and timing and whatnot. So we really have the full gamut of environments that we've been able to test over this 4-year period. The key thing to know here is that there's not one single crop response that's driving this overall yield response we see. And we actually see several that I'll talk about here in just a second. The first one is kind of the one that we generally expect when we talk about high fertility conditions in zone place fertility, is just that overall plant response. With a lot of the hybrids that we test, we see a response of larger plants, a little bit better vigor, and on that right side, you see a little bit bigger leaves. So why do we care about bigger leaves? Well, when we have bigger leaves, that's more green space, more opportunity for photosynthesis that hopefully translates to yield later on in the growing season. The second thing that we see is an opportunity to address some of these weather-induced sulfur deficiencies or nutrient deficiencies. A lot of times we don't know they're going to exist until we put the seed in the ground and it comes up. But because of the diverse fertility or nutrient package that we're applying with this treatment, we're able to kind of adjust or to respond to whatever fertility deficiencies we might see. This photo is a sulfur-induced deficiency that we saw at our Clay Center site in 2022. And again, planted in the cool, wet conditions where sulfur availability from the soil was low. The sulfur contained in that fertilizer was able to act as a supplement and help that plant grow through those conditions until more plant or more soil-based sulfur was available. The last thing that we see is actually on the back end. So, the first two things we talk about were those early season responses. And on the back end, with some of these hybrids, they're responding to the incremental fertility through increased staging. So what is that? And we catch favorable conditions, maybe we catch a late season rainfall. This plant still has the opportunity to go through photosynthesis and hopefully pack on a little bit more yield on the back end. The plants on the left side with the base fertility, those are already completely senesced. Very, very little, if any, green leaf area is remaining there, which means they have very little, if any, opportunity to go through photosynthesis and produce yield. So we do see a little bit of a staging with some of our hybrids in that later opportunity for photosynthesis with the incremental fertility. So this kind of gives us a pause as we, in the middle of the data, where as we think through this type of a management practice, is this something where incremental fertility is only going to be beneficial in these high yielding environments? Excellent. You guys are on the ball this morning. So this is a response that is probably going to be a little bit surprising. No. And what we've seen over the 4 years within our data is that even in these low to marginal to moderate yielding environments, maybe that 200, where we broke the data up was at 200 bushel and below, we still saw some pretty strong value of the incremental fertility program. Now, if you think about it, there could be a lot of reasons related to that. Maybe those are the fields where they're not getting as much fertility, or they can't handle high fertility. Maybe they've got some other type of yield limitations there. But regardless of whatever the specific reason for these responses, we still see value on those type of acres. So really the take home of this slide is that no matter what yield level we're looking at, doesn't matter if it's a low yielding environment or that ultra high 250, 260 bushel and above type of environment, our data still shows that there is value to incremental fertility at all of these yield levels. The last thing I'm going to talk about is what do we do with this information? How can we use it to help you place and select hybrids for your farm a little bit more efficiently? And that is looking at how do hybrids respond to incremental fertility. First and foremost, like we've been kind of showing through this presentation thus far, testing at a lot of sites over multiple years is critical to accurately and confidently characterize these hybrids. So that's first and foremost to creating strong recommendations, is getting a wide gamut of testing. The example I'm going to show you is an example of two 110 hybrids that we have in our portfolio. The first one is G10B61, which is a hybrid that we characterize as a highly responsive hybrid to incremental fertility. As we look at this hybrid, first and foremost, we see a 5.6 bushel yield response above the site average overall. And then on top of that, when we look at the individual site to site by site comparisons, in nearly all of those comparisons, we see G10B61 outperforming the site average. So not only because of that overall yield response, but also its consistency from site to site, that helps us understand and determine that hybrid is highly responsive to incremental fertility. On the other side of the spectrum is another 110-day hybrid, G10U97. This hybrid was actually 3.2 bushel below the overall site response when it comes to its response to incremental fertility. And then once again, as we compare those blue bars to the black bars at site by site, we see in general that it is pretty similar, if not below, the overall site average at a lot of those locations, which again helps us understand and characterize that hybrid as being a low responding hybrid to incremental fertility. So to kind of wrap up this part of my talk, we saw a 13.5 bushel response across a wide range of environments and weather conditions to that incremental fertility. We also see that it's got value to across a wide level wide range of yield levels, not just those high yielding levels that we sometimes think about. And then lastly, this information is critical for us to characterize these hybrids so that we can better improve our placement of them according to that field's nutrient status or based on an individual grower's fertility management style. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about nitrogen side dressing. First and foremost, why do we even consider nitrogen side dressing? Obviously the easy approach is being able to make all of your nitrogen application as a blanket rate at one time, meaning one trip across the field. So what is the value of us making multiple trips across the field, or making at least that second trip across the field and splitting up our nitrogen rate? And really the first and foremost of it is around the dynamics of nitrogen, where it is a highly mobile nutrient. It has no affinity to soil particles. Therefore, it is free to move throughout the soil profile, typically down when there's excess moisture. So when we side dress, that reduces the opportunity for nitrogen to be lost, because there's basically two pathways for nitrogen. It can either be lost or it can be taken up by the plant. And when we don't have crop uptake, that means it's only avenue for movement is through losses. The second thing that nitrogen side dressing allows for us is our ability to improve our nitrogen supply kind of real time. So think back through to where, maybe we've got a year where conditions at planting were really good. We've got great early season growth. Everything is looking good. And you know what? I feel like this field is going to be another 10 or 20 bushel above what I originally anticipated. Nitrogen side dressing allows us that opportunity to make that correction kind of real time, so to speak. Or on the other side, maybe it was a situation where, I made my nitrogen application 3 weeks later, I got 5 inches of rain on that field and I lost a lot. Well, this nitrogen side dressing allows us that opportunity to make that deficiency or that deficit correction. So I'm going to talk about a couple trials here about what can we really focus on to help improve that nitrogen application. And the first one is around timing. So when we think about nitrogen side dress application, typically we're looking at that V3 to V8 window, or whatever kind of point where we can't get the tractor through it anymore because it's too tall. What we look at this trial is, can we make an application with the planter, and does it yield similarly to those later side dress applications? So you might be asking yourself, why would I want to make a planter applied application in addition to my base rate? And there's a couple reasons behind this. First and foremost, that application allows us the opportunity to remove a trip across the field. So what does that mean? That means less time spent in the tractor seat, less diesel burned by the tractor when you're making that pass. Can we eliminate that pass and still effective by doing a planter application and still reap the value of the side dress treatment? The second part is, think about those seasons where it's wet. I can't get into that field to spray. I can't get into that field to make my nitrogen application. What do? Well, the planter applied treatment can potentially kind of mitigate the risk of not being able to get into the field later on if we have those wet conditions. So within this trial, we conducted in 2024, and we had 3 different application treatments in addition to our control. We had that planter application, which was an application through surface dribble, and then we had 2 in-season applications, one at V3 and another one at the V10 growth stage, and those were done by Y drops. In all occasions, we were making applications of 60 pounds per acre of nitrogen as 32% UAN, and most importantly, the pre-plant rates at these sites were based on the site's individual yield goals. And our side dress rates that we added, so that additional 60 pounds, that was additive to the pre-plant base rates. We did not subtract 60 pounds from our overall pre-plant rate. We wanted to see what was the effect of the additive nitrogen in addition to our pre-plant blanket rate. So going through the data, first and foremost, we saw a yield response of at least 8.2 bushel per acre to that additive nitrogen side dress application. So again, even though we were a situation where all these sites, the base nitrogen rate was applied according to our yield goals, we still saw value of making that additive side dress application. When we look at comparisons of that planter application versus the in-season, the planter application was 3.2 bushel below the in-season applications. And the driver probably behind that is thinking through the dynamics of nitrogen and its mobility and ability for loss compared to crop uptake. So typically with nitrogen, our crop uptake really starts to take off around that V5 growth stage. So as we look at this data and think through it, with that planter applied application, we didn't have any nitrogen uptake happening. So therefore, it was exposed for loss. We probably did lose a little bit, and it really came through in the data showing that our in-season application side dress rates was slightly better than a planter applied application. Okay, next trial I'm going to talk about is let's bring stabilizers into this conversation. Now, obviously, I think we have a pretty good understanding of what stabilizers do and how they protect our investment, but we haven't really thought a lot about, is there value when we think about a little bit smaller quantities? 60 pounds of nitrogen with the side dress. Is there value to adding a stabilizer in that type of a situation? And this is really an extension of what we had done with that prior trial. The only kind of new twist to it was we're now adding a treatment with the stabilizer. So all of these applications, whether it was a planter or the in-season application, was also applied with or without a nitrogen stabilizer. And this stabilizer had activity against volatilization through NBPT, as well as denitrification and leaching through DCD. What we found with this trial was that the greatest value associated with that stabilizer came through with the planter applied treatment. So again, thinking back to why we probably saw a little bit lower yields with the planter applied treatment a few slides back, this nitrogen stabilizer in this aspect actually kept that nitrogen where it needed to be and reduced its risk for loss. And we saw that through a positive yield response of 3.7 bushel. Also, interestingly, is when we compare the timing treatments of planter applied versus the in-season treatments with the addition of the stabilizer, we actually see the stabilized nitrogen applied by the planter to yield much closely aligned with the in-season applications. So what this is telling me is that if we are going to do this type of an approach and make an additive side dress nitrogen application with the planter, we can achieve it with yields that are in the same ballpark as we see with our in-season applications. So to kind of summarize everything with the nitrogen trial, regardless of which trial it was, we saw a benefit to that additive nitrogen application through side dressing of 8.2 bushel per acre across a wide range of environments. We also see that when it comes to timing, the most effective timing of side dress really needs to align with when that rapid uptake begins. Because when we don't have plant uptake of nitrogen or it's low, that's just an increased opportunity for that nitrogen to be lost and leached out of the rooting zone of the corn plant. Lastly, stabilizers have value, and our trial showed that they really have more value when that application does happen further away from that uptake window. So as we look at it and kind of consider, do we want to do this type of a planter applied side dress application? Our data would suggest that including that stabilizer within that tank is going to help protect our investment until that uptake begins. All right, so that concludes everything that we wanted to talk about this morning on the call. Again, on behalf of the Agronomy and Action team, I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in and learning a little bit about what we're doing for research. What is on the screen right now is the QR code for our 2025 Agronomy and Action research book. That book has about 20 research articles that we conducted in corn and soybeans this year. So there's a lot of great information across a wide range of crop management, fertility, and so on variables. So please scan that link and thumb through that book. And as we go through 2025, if you have any questions about the trials or would like more information, please contact your agronomist and we will do our best to get additional information to you. With that, Julia, I will turn it back over to you for wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. And thank you, Brad and Bruce, as well. What a great hour we've spent here this Thursday morning. So like Aaron mentioned, this is a QR code that'll take you directly to the research report. You can also access this great resource just by going to the Golden Harvest website as well. So with that, and I'm going to go ahead and look at some of the questions that we have in the Q&A here this Morning. So the first question that came in from Rick, and this was when we were talking through the soybean trial, Brad, is can you talk at all about the return on investment on the trials that we do as a general statement with your research group, and or maybe that soybean one particularly?
Yeah, I can speak to that. Didn't talk about much of the ROI today. We've done a little bit of that in the past, and sometimes it's a little bit challenging for us to do because we don't quite know what you're buying your inputs for. We don't know what you're buying your nitrogen for, or what you're selling your corn for. So we kind of just give you the bushel response and kind of leave that up to the growers on what they can sell their grain for and what they can buy their nitrogen for. So didn't talk about that today, but encourage you to look at those yield bushels and see what makes sense on your farm.
I'll maybe add to that real quick, Brad. Just, I mean, if within the specific trial that you present on soybeans, the fungicide was the key thing that stood out. And so in order to have an economic ROI, you're going to have a positive bushels to begin with. And if you run those numbers at 2.2 bushels, that what the response that you saw on average, higher in a lot of scenarios, right? But on average, 2.2 at a pretty normal price for Mirvis Neo. I've used $2, a little over $2 an ounce, on just a price I found real quick. That's roughly a $5 an acre ROI on that particular input that you looked at. So,
and even greater depending on location. If we had the
exactly.
5.6 bushel response, even greater there.
Great. Due to time, I'm going to move to the next question here quickly. Aaron, we have a question around your side dress trials. So when you refer to pre-plant nitrogen, is that anhydrous or liquid, and is it spring applied or fall applied?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Since we have such a wide range of locations and geographies, and the majority of our trials are done on farm, we have kind of a range. We have some that are fall versus spring applied. And from when it comes to a source standpoint, again, most of our sites are going to be liquid nitrogen, but we do have a few in there that are anhydrous ammonia as well. So it's really dependent based on individual growers, but we do have a wide range.
I got a question around the research kind of report. Will this be a printed book that will be coming out in person, or is it something that's just virtual? That was a question that was put in the chat. Bruce, maybe you can address that statement or question there.
Yeah, so based on historic demand and everything, we're kind of experimenting a little bit this year with the digital format as our primary method for that. So this year will be a little different than in prior years. We're not planning on printing. Again, this is kind of an experiment, and we'll, based on the feedback we get from this, look at how we need to do that and approach it in 2026. But for this year, go to the website that Julia mentioned, or if you were able to scan that. But if you weren't able to scan it real quickly, go into the Golden Harvest website, you'll be able to hone in on the download version of the digital book.
Great. Bruce, and our last question, and then we'll wrap here this morning. You had answered it over text in the Q&A, but I figured you might want to voice it over. The question was around the total amount of N applied on the different trials. Could you just voice that over for anyone that might not be able to see their screen or read the Q&A box?
Yeah, there was a lot of questions around. We saw some questions on what varieties were that and those kind of things. So again, referring back to the book, you can get all those level of details there. But in specific to the nitrogen questions, the first trial that Brad went through, and from a corn perspective and the management factors, that was 17 pounds per acre of nitrogen that was in that. The portion that Aaron went through, the study looking at incremental fertility, that was a 77-pound rate of nitrogen there. And then the later studies that Aaron presented was from the side dressing part of it, that was a 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre rate that was used in that. So a little bit different for each one, and with or without other things as well. So again, referring back to that book, you'll have all that listed out in there for reference.
All right. Thank you, Bruce. I also want to thank Brad and Aaron for your time this morning to go through some of the trial work that your team supports. I'm going to go ahead and wrap us here today. I appreciate everyone that's tuned in and has stayed a few extra minutes as we have tried to wrap today's content. Not only can you access the research report online via the Golden Harvest website, you can also find the recordings from today and all future Insight series that we'll be hosting. So appreciate the time this morning, but want to thank you all, and we will see you next Thursday. Thank you all, and have a great week.